welcome. We're so glad that you're here. And my name is Jennifer Barron-Prawl, and I'm very, very pleased to be kicking off today's event. This is our third webinar session from our Person-Centered Recovery Planning Consultation Corner. Today's topic is peer specialist roles in PCRP, aligning with peer ethics and values. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Just for folks to know that this presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, which is also known as SAMHSA. The opinions that are expressed in the presentation today are the views of our speakers, who are Janice, Amanda, and Amy, and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. Okay, next slide. This webinar that we're doing today is actually a joint effort that's sponsored by the New England MHTTC in Region 1 and the South-Southwest MHTTC in Region 6. So you'll see by looking at the map that there are regions all over the country. Region 1 is up there in the corner in green, and Region 6 is in purple. The goals of our MHTTC are to strengthen the mental health workforce and to help provide people and organizations the opportunity to incorporate effective practices in the mental health processes. So take a peek at your area and know that there are lots of training materials for you in each of our regions. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Our MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, recovery-oriented language in all of our activities. So we encourage you to also demonstrate that same level of awareness in your comments and in the chat box messages today. Language matters, and we work to make this a safe place for everyone. So thank you for practicing being kind. Okay, with the next slide, you'll see a few housekeeping items for today. We've made every attempt to keep today's presentation secure. So if for any reason we have to end the presentation, we'll email you all back at the email that you've registered on. We are in a Zoom meeting platform, so you are able to unmute and share. If you're comfortable having your video on, please do so. We love to be able to see you. If you have a question or a comment, please use the chat box and respond to everyone. There's an ability to do that so that everyone can see your comments. Both Christine and I will be monitoring the chat box, and we'll be sure to get back with you and provide resources throughout the webinar for you to see. Know that this session will be recorded, and both the recording and the slide deck will be made available to you following the presentation. If you do stay for the full presentation, know that you will be receiving a 1.5 CEU certificate from me from our South-Southwest MHTTC email. And just be sure to check with your licensing board to ensure acceptance of the CEUs in your states. All right, so with that, I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to pass you over to Dr. Janice Tandora, who will then share more information about our PCRP resources. Janet,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. My name's Janice Tandora. I'm the co-director of the New England MHTTC. It's my pleasure to welcome you. Before we move on, given your interest in this topic and you joining us today, I want to make sure you're all aware of a recently released hot off the presses resource that was put out just last month by SAMHSA. It's a SAMHSA PCP issue brief, and it was actually released and shared with all state mental health program directors all around the country. And I had the opportunity to be involved in the creation and the drafting of this resource. And I will say we worked very hard to pack it with as many practical tips and tools as possible to really help state and other organizational leaders align their systems of care in support of really high quality, high integrity, person-centered planning. So please do check it out. There's a link in the chat box. Feel free to share it widely. And next slide. I think Amy, oh, there we go. Feel free to come on back and join us because this series, we're at the midway point, 3 of 6, as Jen said, and it really is designed to hit a lot of the FAQs in person-centered recovery planning to help you meet these kinds of emerging expectations. So again, hope to see some of you back, and feel free to check out our upcoming events. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Amanda and Amy, who prefer to introduce themselves, I do want to at least first just express my own personal gratitude to both of them for being here today, but also really for the leadership that they have shown in all the work that they have done over the years, not just on this particular topic, but around person-centered recovery planning in general. And I had the good fortune to meet Amanda and Amy over 10 years ago in some systems change work that I was doing in the state of Texas. And I often say that I see the states that make the most progress with their PCRP implementation and do it with the most integrity are really the states that figure out how to ground their change efforts authentically, really in the wisdom of lived experience. And there's lots of ways you can do that, but one way that you can do it is by being really intentional and thoughtful about the critical role that peer support specialists can play in this process. And I will say that in 2 decades of doing this work, Amanda and Amy are among the most thoughtful people that I have honestly had the pleasure to work with doing work in this space. So my gratitude to both of you. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your leadership. And I'm going to turn it on over to Amy to say a little bit more about what they're bringing to the conversation today.
Well, thank you, Janice. I really appreciate that. I don't know how you go from there, but my name is Amy Pearson. As Janice said, I stepped into this work and started hearing about this. It's been over 10 years ago around the PCRP process. My both personal background as well as my work background stems from my own lived experience as a person with mental health challenges and navigating the private and public system of care. And a number of years ago, which it's actually been 24 years, which is almost a really weird thing in itself. I actually started working at the same state hospital I had been hospitalized at for almost a year. And it was within that process where I started hearing about doing some change around seclusion restraint and restraint reduction. And that's how I fell into this conversation around peer support. And so my background comes from implementing peer services in both the state hospital system as well as the public mental health system, as well as non-traditional systems, working with organizations across not only Texas, the US, but internationally in many different recovery related initiatives. I've had so many different opportunities and experiences. And, for me, where it all comes back to is being able to utilize my lived experience to support the work that so many else are also doing to be able to create the best spaces and places for people to really heal. So I'm excited about this conversation. I'm excited once again to facilitate with Amanda and Janice. I, just learned so much. And I always say, just kind of as a caveat, I worked at the state hospital for almost 13 years. And when I heard about this, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, I was like, okay, it's time for me to finally be discharged. Right. And I heard about the PCRP program. It was the thing that had me be discharged to go work in a different system of care and try something new because of my excitement around this conversation. So currently I work with organizations implementing different recovery-oriented services around the state of Texas and a little bit of this and that. So I'm going to throw it to Amanda to share a little bit more about who you are.
All right, great. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see everybody with us, including some fellow Texans, as well as people from all over the US. You can read a little bit more about me on the slide if you haven't already been to one of our consultation corners. But mainly what you need to know as we go into some of these conversations is I am a clinical social worker using her lived experience, both in the clinical work that I did, but also in the systems change work that I do. And I've had the great pleasure to work alongside Amy and doing a lot of that organizational change work, and also learning about the recovery movement and what it takes to really, like Janice was talking about, bring the voices of people with lived experience to the forefront of that change work. So really excited to be here. So enough about us. Let's do a quick poll to find out who all we have here with us today. Christine, if you could launch that poll, we'll get some quick stats on who's here. So you should see that pop up. Take a minute to tell us the one or more hats that you're wearing today. And we don't pretend to be able to know all of them, so you have an option there to tell us as well. We'll just give another couple seconds here to give everybody a minute to get that entered in, and then we'll share our results. Looks like about half the group with us today are peer supporters in their role, and we've got a number of different other roles. Okay, Christina, looks like we can probably close that and share the results with everyone. Excellent. All right. Well, let us tell you a little bit more about what to expect from the session. All righty. So we are hoping that at the end of this, and 90 minutes is not very long for us to dive into this rich topic, but we are hoping that you'll be able to take away at least one must do and must not do related to the role of peer support and PCRP. Be able to name at least one way that ethics really plays a part in the role of professional peer support and person-centered approach. And then also identify resources. Now, we do want to make a note, we are going to be referencing many resources throughout this session, and we're going to drop some of those links in the chat box as we go. Don't worry, you do not have to collect those resources as we go. Everyone who attends will get a follow-up email with a nice, tidy list of links. So you can just wait and get them all at the end. If you would like to do that. But before we go on, we wanted to have one more chance to get you to think a little bit about this topic. Pressed it too many times there, Amy. So I want to invite you to think a little bit about where we're starting from on this topic. So Christine, if you'd help us launch the next poll. And this one is just a basic rating of your understanding of this topic. Now, you may have noticed that we're really talking about peer support within a clinical behavioral health provider agency. So some of you might be familiar with peer support as it exists in a peer-run organization or a different type of setting. Right? So we're really wanting to get a sense of where everybody's knowledge and experiences with peer support within a clinical setting. So we'll give everybody a minute to. All right, we can share those results. So it looks like many of you are coming with some good examples and stories. So that's great. All right, thank you for that. And then we've got one more poll to offer here, and this will be kind of a preview of some of the things that we're hoping to get to in our 90 minutes today. So let's go ahead and launch the next poll. And we wanted to come up with 4 questions that will preview some of what we're aiming to cover today. Some of them are kind of like some scenario things. And some of these, there is a technical assistance session that'll be happening in a few weeks that everyone will get a link to register for as well. And that'll be an opportunity to do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of these rich topics. And so what we don't cover today, we might be able to dive into a little bit more deeply then. But just take a minute and see. You will need to scroll down to see all 4 questions. We'll give everybody a couple minutes. Oh, that's okay, Ralph. Yeah, it's easy to do that. Looks like most people have finished. We'll give just one more minute here. And okay, we can share the results. And I dropped those questions in the chat box as well, just in case people wanted to refer back to those, or in case you hit submit a little bit too quickly, which is easy to do. Okay, we're not going to go over the answers. We just wanted to give you something to anticipate and maybe engage everybody a little bit. All right. So here we go. Let's see if we can get to all of that within our time. I feel challenged, Amy. Let's see
We
what
can
we
do
can
it,
do.
Amanda. We can do it.
Okay. All right. So
I believe in ourselves.
recovery planning. If you did not attend the webinar that we had that went over the basics of PCRP, and this was on April 17th, there is a recording that you can access. But let me just tell you a couple of things that you need to understand when we talk about PCRP. So there's a lot of different types of recovery planning out there that are excellent for wellness planning. But when we talk about PCRP, we're really talking about the type of planning that goes on where people are offered and have the opportunity to select professional services. But PCRP differs from a traditional service planning approach in these key ways. It amplifies the voice and choice by the person. It includes the identity of the person beyond their behavioral health condition. It includes action steps they're going to take beyond those professional services. That's key. And it also anticipates improvements and progress beyond just compliance, right? Beyond just performance within the system, right? So it really emphasizes a quality life worth living in the community. And then here's the final point. Now, I always want to make this one. This is really key because it's like, why all the focus on the clinical system, Amanda? Like, come on, Janice. Like, why is the clinical stuff so important? Well, the clinical part is what needs to be fixed, right? So by talking about being person-centered within the clinical system, it communicates an expectation that clinical providers demonstrate person-centered principles, practices, and competencies. And I think that's really, really key here. Another thing that I like to point out, and this is kind of my elevator definition, my elevator pitch for PCRP, you know, us clinicians, we love to talk about what people's needs are, and it kind of gets under my skin. I think we should be talking more about what people want. So that's just kind of a key takeaway. And then one last thing, and I think this is a really nice frame for talking about PCRP. Uh-oh.
Sorry, I had to get rid
Look
of
happy
my,
over there, my partner.
I had to get rid of my the whole thing in the middle of it, and I tried. I was like, maybe it won't do it, but it did it. I apologize.
So if you attended the other webinar, you are familiar with this, and we are offering it up as a resource. So this is a great document. It looked at a lot, you know, person-centered planning is a phrase that is getting referenced a lot by a lot of different programs, a lot of different states, a lot of different agencies all over the world. And particularly in the US, it's mandated by a lot of different programs and agencies. So NCAPS did a really cool thing. They looked at what do all these different mandates have in common, and different quality indicators? And they came up with 5 different competency domains for staff who are expected to do person-centered planning. So I encourage you to take a look at this document, and you can find out more about these domains by looking back at that recording of the other webinar. So Amy, I'm going to pass it over to you to just cover a little bit about peer support basics.
If I would have
Do
just
that
waited
for
one
us.
more second, I would have had the control again and been able to click that button. But just kind of like Amanda just did on the basics of person-centered planning, we're just going to do like a high level, like orientation to what peer support is, and then really dive into this conversation. But just as going over a few of the basics, I do want to ask a question. And if you're good with it, if you could actually, in your chat box, you're going to hear us call in the peer providers, peer support specialists, certified peer specialists, et cetera, peer professionals, peer staff. If you don't mind, like where you are, where you work, if you work with peer professionals, what does your organization call peer specialist or peer certified peer specialist, et cetera? It just it's always an interesting thing to me, what the actual titles are or what people are referring to in relationship to what we deem as a peer role. And just hit it in the chat. Certified peer specialist. So a lot of certified peer specialists, peer recovery specialists, peer recovery coaches, coach. Thank you for just putting those in. Just kind of, once again, I think it's always a great opportunity for us to learn as a community what some of the different language is. I probably will use a couple of different things. Texas has taken on, in relationship to persons who have that commonality with behavioral or mental health challenges, it's a mental health peer specialist, right? So it's an MHPS, but if I say anything around peer specialist, we know what I'm referring to, if that's all right with y'all. And so there are so many definitions in relationship to what a peer specialist is, and really specifically looking at that mental health peer specialist. This is a definition by Sherry Mead that I always really like. And I like it specifically because it has this conversation around, it's about understanding another situation empathically through the shared experience of emotional and psychological pain. But it's that place of like connecting at that heart to heart from a mutual experience, and that space of being able to be with one another, not do or anything else. Once again, there's so many different definitions, and I do want to just kind of pop this up too. When I think about peer specialists, and I think about like other and different ways to like define what that peer work is, one of my favorite quotes is in relationship to, I don't know if any of y'all have heard this, but like, I'm an expert at not being an expert, and that takes a lot of expertise. Because for me, when I like really think about that peer work role, like that's what we are. Like, we're an expert at not being an expert, and staying out of that role of expert, it takes a lot, right? And I think it's just that heart of what peer work is. And it's one of the things as a peer support supervisor at times, and really bringing in and educating others around the peer role, I use this quote a lot because people seem to kind of get this, right? When we say that a peer specialist really comes from that place of mutual learning, it comes from that place of supporting rather than directing, it comes from that place of honoring an individual's self-determination and, supporting them in choosing their own path and direction. Like this little quote is a lot of times my kind of comeback when I get pushback from others. And we're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. we start looking at, and if we start like going into and a little bit further into starting to look at peer specialists and their role within the person-centered planning process, there's a blog post by Patricia Deegan, and it's going to be popped into your chat, that I really, really love. And for me, there's a place of, when you look at it, she gives the peer specialist perspective, the overlap, and the clinical perspective. And when we think about the peer specialist role, it's like they're trained, and there's the training, and even within peer specialist ethics, code of ethics, it's about advocating for and with participants, right? Advocating for what their voice, what they're wanting to have said and heard. And just some of the different ways that advocacy may look like. And the fact about it, advocating for participants' legal rights, civil rights, and human rights. And I bring that up when we start looking at this like broad look at peer specialists and peer support, because truly, by the heart of what peer work is, it came out of the civil rights movement. And when we really started implementing peer services within the traditional systems of care, some of those foundations of what this work are kind of got a lot of pushback, right? Because you're supporting people in finding their voice, you're supporting people in advocating. At times, you're supporting them and asking for what their needs may be that may go against what the team is thinking that their needs may be. And if a peer specialist is doing that, they're doing their job, right? So once we just threw this in, you're going to get this resource. I really love this. This is from Brass Tacks from SAMHSA. It has another definition of what peer support is. What peer support does, it also has some information around some data and research. If you're wanting to learn more about peer support, just really quickly, it's a one-pager. We just wanted to kind of highlight that and show this to you. And I did want to point out about one of the things it says. It says, this mutuality, often called peerness, between a peer support worker and a person in or seeking services, promotes connection and inspires hope. And when we're thinking about and starting to look at like this conversation about the role that peer support workers can support and play within that person-centered planning process, for me and my own self and what I've seen along my journey and working with others, if a person doesn't have that little bit of hope, it's hard to really effectively go into a planning process and starting to think about, what do I want to get from services, if I don't think that anything is possible, or that there's things I actually want to achieve or want to like grasp towards. And so that place of peer specialists supporting people and connecting and inspiring hope is a really important piece when we start connecting and looking at the person-centered planning process. And I know for many of us, like the SAMHSA has so many different articles and documents that have come out around the peer support worker role. And one of the things I do want to highlight, which I love that so many of you have this knowledge around peer support, which is why I'm going really quickly through this, is that SAMHSA went around and basically surveyed peer specialists or peer support workers from across the country and got a lot of information in. So all of these like core competencies that came from persons actually doing the work. But if we look at this category 5, and you're actually going to we're going to put in the Dropbox or the chat, it's probably there, you'll get this resource. SAMHSA came out with these core competencies. And one of those categories is actually the fact that peer support workers support recovery planning. Right? It's right here, like right here. And I love how it like breaks things out and looks at some of the different ways that a peer support worker can support that recovery planning and be able to still maintain the efficacy of the peer support role. And I know that for myself, as someone who's worked within the system for so many years, there's always been a lot of back and forth about like, how can you work within the system in a clinical system and still be a peer support worker? And like, how do you balance those things? And it really comes down to, for myself, and when we're looking at this, is me honoring and staying within those code of ethics that I have as a peer support worker, staying within and honoring these core competencies. And there's a number of different resources that will give you. And when I do that, I'm able to fulfill and stay in that beautiful space that a peer support worker role was created and brings to a behavioral health organization. And it does take a lot at times as a peer support worker when you're working within the clinical system to stay within those spaces and find like your voice and maintain that. And that's what we're going to kind of go into a little bit further here in a second. And I'm going to throw it over. It's like, you're not next to me anymore, Amanda. I always like it when you're next to me in person. But I'm going to
That's why you got to throw. That's
I know,
why
I'm
you
going
can't
to throw it
hand.
to you, Amanda,
All
to
right.
talk about this conversation.
Yeah, so there are versions of this graphic that have been floating around for a while. So this may look somewhat familiar to you. I really like this. It invites you to think about the level of mutuality that exists in a relationship, or the power differential, right? Because that's a really important thing to think about within a helping relationship or a helping role. So we could talk all afternoon using this one slide, and I'm not able to do that within our time constraints, but I want to make a couple of notes using this continuum. So obviously, I think we all probably know that, you know, peer support is a professional service. It's not friendship, right? Which we see over here on the right end of this continuum, that, you know, hopefully if it's a good friendship, it's completely reciprocal, it's mutual, it's happening naturally out in the community, right? And then way over on the other end of the continuum is that traditional expert-driven clinical provider, where there really doesn't seem to be any personal kind of sharing or feeling of maybe authenticity in the relationship, right? You kind of get that old feeling of like you're laying on the couch and you're not even maybe making eye contact, right? And then there's all sorts of different relationships that you have in between, right? And so I just really want to highlight that recovery-oriented clinical provider in a clinical service setting that's in between. So when I introduced myself, I mentioned that I am a clinician using her lived experience, right? You know, many people think that social workers are prohibited from using their lived experience in their work. This is not true. In fact, I've done some trainings where, you know, inviting clinical staff to explore how they might use self-disclosure effectively within their clinical role. However, when I do that, it does not erase all the power differential that exists within that relationship, right? It doesn't turn me into a peer provider. And so a lot of what Amy and I do and the work that we do in trainings and in, you know, consultative work with organizations and with supervisors and with peer specialists is really making sure that that differentiation is clear. Are you in a clinical role using your lived experience, which is amazing, we need more of that, or are you in a peer support role and not ever being directive and not, you know, and really trying to minimize that power differential. So I'll stop there for now, and let's really dive into putting those two things together, right? So the role of peer support and how it interfaces with what we've been talking about throughout this series, which is the person-centered recovery planning practice and model. So we want to invite you in the chat box as I continue to just share what you already know and maybe you're involved with in your work. How can peer providers support and strengthen the practice of PCRP at an agency? My guess is you all are already coming with a lot of great stories and examples of how this can happen. So I'm going to keep moving on with our content, but I would love to hear some of your stories and examples by chat. And this will help us build our TA session as well. So please take a minute and drop some of that into the chat. Okay, so peer support and PCRP are naturally complementary. So they reinforce one another just by existing together. And this is really cool. And when I was in an executive leadership position at Austin State Hospital, I worked there for about 13 years. This was happening alongside one another. Our peer support program was new and growing and thriving at the same time that we were figuring out what person-centered recovery planning really meant and how to implement it hospital-wide. And I didn't realize at the time, it wasn't intentional on my part, but when I look back, it's so clear and it makes so much sense why we were able to do both at the same time, right? And I think that that's probably clear to most of you all as well. So the essential function of peer support, the values and the ethics of peer support naturally result in outcomes that promote things that are required in person-centered recovery planning, right? That renewed sense of hope, people taking ownership of their treatment and their lives when and if that's become diminished over time, right? But also the systems improvements, right, that we need, that need to be rooted in practical wisdom and lived experience. And also, there are positive effects of peer support that sustain over time. And what I mean by that is, imagine a person that gets peer support and they become really good at advocating for their own needs. And 2 years later, they're getting professional services at another agency that doesn't even have peer support. And they encounter, you know, an old school, expert-driven provider who's stomping all over their rights and all over their voice and their choice, but they're ready for it. And they're ready for it as the direct result of having had that peer support 2 years prior at another agency, maybe even in another city, right? So we're going to talk a lot about this intentional complementary relationship between peer support and PCRP, right? But within an agency. But I love to point out that if we just make peer support more accessible, as long as it has integrity and it's quality peer support, and we're allowing peer supporters to stay in the role that they were meant to do, then it's naturally promoting PCRP within the broader system as well. So Amy and I started joking when we were designing this that PCRP and peer support go together like peanut butter and jelly, and then it ended up on the slide. So sorry, not sorry for that one. We even see this to be true. Janice wrote a great article that has stood the test of time. What was that, 15, 20 years ago now, Janice? Where she wrote the top 10 concerns that people voice when they are expected to implement a person-centered approach to planning within their agency. We hear the same things over and over again. And just here somewhat recently, there emerged this great article where those top 10 concerns that are very much myths about why PCRP can't happen have been matched to how peer support can address those concerns within an agency. So it's a very cool resource to check out. We'll make sure that you have the link. And I just featured one here just to highlight the nice partnership between implementing PCRP at an agency and then also having a really, really quality, well-run peer support program as well. So you see here this concern number 3, that person-centered care planning is really time-consuming and labor-intensive. We hear that a lot. Well, having peer supporters there that can carry some of that load and help with, in some of the ways that Amy is getting ready to talk about, can really help with the extra time and labor that is involved with quality planning, right? So Amy, you want to talk to us a little bit about what you have explored with that role of peer support and PCRP? You've got some good stories.
I know, and I got all these pictures, and I'm like, oh, that's in New Zealand. That makes me like, I love that little beach. But primarily how I'm going to do this next section, just to kind of like give y'all an idea, is mostly through story. And as peer specialists, so often how we share, how we educate is also through story, using our lived experience. And so just a little bit more about me, and I know I did the introduction, is I spent many, many years in and out of institutions, in and out of places, in and out of housing programs, to the point where I've been hospitalized 40 to 50 times. And my life really had been at the place and the space where the expectation for my life was that I would not go back to school. I wouldn't live on my own, all of these things because of the diagnoses I was given. And that was reflected on my treatment plans. And I only say that because I actually didn't know I had treatment plans until years later when I started doing this work and going, treatment plans, what does this look like? And actually requested them. Like, I didn't even know what was on those plans. And there were things like I was going to be med compliant. I was going to accept my diagnosis. I was going to stay out of the hospital for 2 months in a row. Like, those were things that were on there. And at a point in my life, and this is something I've seen over and over and over for persons, many times you just kind of give up. And you also, for me, there was this place that I had a lot of fear and even hoping. But thankfully, I had some people in my life who like had me start exploring like what could be possible, had me start exploring what my dreams and my hopes were. And to the point that when a position actually opened up at the state hospital where I'd been hospitalized at for almost a year, and I saw it and I was like, it's a part-time position. It was all the things I knew I could do. I'm like, I'm going to go for that. Right. And when I told my team, there was a lot of concerns. There was a lot of concerns I was getting unwell again. Because on my treatment plan, the things I was working towards were this med compliance, this acknowledging the diagnoses I had, staying out of the hospital, and all of a sudden I'm talking about like this huge risk. But what I felt inside, and I still to this day, I get really excited about, like when I saw that position and knew like I can do this, there was an excitement in me that started really moving me forward in a way in my own well-being and recovery that nothing else had before. And that's what I see when we start looking at and start thinking about this work around the person-centered planning process. When we start looking at and bringing forth, like, what are those possibilities? I can't tell you how many times when I was doing some pre-planning work with individuals, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but I was like, okay, so like what's missing in your life? Like, what do you want to do? What excites you? I want to be able to play with my grandkids. And all of a sudden, everything in their face would shift. Well, in order to be able to do that, there were certain things like they worked towards, right? Which is part of that person-centered recovery planning. But as a peer specialist, I was able to kind of go in and connect from that space of lived experience, that space around what reaching towards goals that actually like enliven someone can do versus looking at those same goals or those things, same things on a treatment plan that met the medical necessity or the things that everyone had. But like, I don't want to just be med compliant, right? There's things I want to do. And one of the beautiful things that peer specialists can do and do It's support that place of building up a space of hope for people to start thinking about, like, what do I want my life to look like? And many times when someone can connect to that, other things start falling into place. And so when we start thinking about the role of a peer specialist, when we start thinking about, you can see certified peer specialists in the language that was before. But when a person chooses to work with a peer provider, this relationship cannot just be really important to the person that they're working or walking alongside. It actually has that potential and that ability to impact the full team. So sorry. You know, Amanda said earlier a little bit ago that, you know, the peer provider and peer provider work actually really is very complementary to the clinical services, to the clinical team in so many different ways. You know, when we think about this role, the role of a peer provider is to walk alongside individuals in their own personal recovery journey. And the peer provider role, one of the really unique things that I always like to bring up, because I don't know that I've seen a code of ethics across the US or even across anywhere else that I've worked where the conversation around self-determination wasn't embedded within the peer specialist role or the code of ethics, that a peer specialist honors a person's self-determination. It's for me to walk alongside and honor whatever it is that they're wanting to reach towards. So sorry. In Texas, there's this very specific code of ethics, and it states the primary responsibility of certified peer specialists is to help people achieve what they want in their life, their own goals, needs, and wants. Certified peer specialists will be guided by the principle of self-determination for all. And, you know, we know that in person-centered recovery planning, the person receiving services actively participates in decisions and takes ownership in their recovery. And when you've not been giving that opportunity before to do that, when you've not been set up or provided that space, it can be really difficult. We talk about a lot of times in peer training or other things, that conversation around personhood versus patienthood. And so often persons who've really been entrenched within the system are so used to persons telling them what it is they need that they've really lost their voice. And the beauty of what a peer provider can bring to the conversation is they can help support an individual to discover and advocate for what they need, highlighting that place of that discover, right? Finding out, looking at, digging around in, exploring what it possibly may be, and then finding ways for their voice to be heard. Peer providers, I join with individuals to discover for this, and it doesn't mean that a peer provider will actually always agree with what the person is wanting to do or what they're wanting in their own life, because there's times that I have concerns. And I'm going to express those concerns, and I'm still going to support the individual in those choices. Right? I just want to kind of put that there. And that's a whole conversation, training, and how that shows up and what it is in itself. But when we start, once again, digging deeper down into the peer role and what a peer provider can bring into the person-centered planning, goal setting, like this process, is that as professional peer providers, like, our only role really is to be that unbiased listener. I am an expert at not being an expert, and that takes a lot of expertise. To be in that space of listening for and reflecting back the person's own innate inner knowledge and supporting them in that place of creative discovery of what it is that they're wanting. It's that place where peer specialists, like, we actually, just by our essence of being there in the role that we are, like, we're a model of what is possible through sharing snippets of our journey, through sharing different experiences we may have had. there's nothing like being able to just state or say those similarities or those common pathways, but also like, here I am today, right? Here I am today. And like, what is it like? What does it look like for you? I don't know, because each of our journeys are distinctly different. Um, we do this so often through sharing a personal lived experience. The cool thing about this, and we start thinking about lived experience, oftentimes persons think about the sharing of lived experience in relationship to the person who's in services. But so often as a peer provider, and especially within this person-centered planning process, my sharing of my own personal lived experience with the clinical staff really has that ability to shift perspectives oftentimes, shift places where there may be like a block for them in seeing what could be possible for this person because of fear or this place of like worried about the person taking risks. And so being able to bring my own knowledge in and being able to bring my own life experience and sharing it in a way that models that, um, there's a beauty that happens. But, we also get to support people to think big, dream big, what they want their life to look like. And I'm not saying that this is always that this is an easy process. Um, but don't we all want to like achieve certain things in our life that lighten us up? Don't we all want to reach for and obtain goals that really move us forward? And when you've been in the system for so long, for many people, um, there's so many limitations that you put on yourself as well, not just from the experiences. And so, as peer providers, we get to really support in different processes and kind of like opening those doors and exploring them in a way that's kind of fun in a lot of ways as well. Find my clickers. And so, the slide here is kind of one of those where there's nothing like being able to connect with another person and sharing that place of understanding that sense of hopelessness. And I don't use that lightly, and I don't know how else to say that. Um, and when we're able to connect there and able to connect from the place of those darker spaces, this place of hopelessness, the place of not thinking anything might change, it creates this foundation which we can build from. And I remember when I was still in services at the state hospital, I was hospitalized at the inpatient setting. And the psychologist who was working with me basically was asking me, like, what did I want to do in my life? And then she asked me, like, what my favorite color was. Like, she just kind of went into the favorite color, kind of like from a weird place. And I was like, what's yours? Because I had learned to get by with asking other people what theirs were and taking it on as mine. Because I didn't even know how to like connect with like what was my favorite color? What did I like? What did I want? Because there was a lot of fear within there. There was a lot of fear in that space because if I dared to hope, like I was just going to end up back in the hospital or I was just going to end up back really unwell. So I stopped hoping. And what I see in this place that a peer provider gets to do is we get to like explore all of these life things. And I will tell you that my favorite color actually is purple. I do know what that is. I may not know today where I want to eat if we're going out to eat with different people because if I really don't care, I don't care. But I do know my favorite color is purple. And then this also doesn't mean that a peer provider has to experience the same exact things that another person has, because we don't. But there's places of connection. And so peer providers can join a person when they're in that space by, this little gentle invitation to be courageous, right? Acknowledging if there's fear present, acknowledging whatever's there, sharing snippets of our story as people start exploring, like, what do I actually want out of my services at this organization. You know, we can create a safe space in that container where a person can do this exploration, right? We can talk about our stories where we've had breakthroughs and moved like barriers and past things we didn't think of that were possible. And we can also share stories where we may have reached for something and didn't quite get it, but like what we learned from that experience. And so there's so many ways in which a peer specialist threads their life experiences in working with an individual as they're going through the person-centered planning process. And it all starts from a place of mutuality. Okay. And I'm like, I hate to see my picture, and I put it on there, so we should just go with that one. Peer specialists and peer providers have this saying, and I remember early on, I don't know, over 20 years ago when I first heard it, and I was still learning like what peer work was and what this role was. And it was like, I am the evidence. So often we talk about evidence-based processes, evidence-based programs. When we think about the work of a peer supporter, like I am the evidence that people can have incredible lives and can navigate really difficult circumstances and, you know, be well and have a life of one's choosing. I am the evidence that a person with so-and-so diagnosis can live beyond those expectations because it's truth, right? And that's one of the things that we are able to bring not only to the persons we're working alongside, but more importantly and often the other colleagues that we work with, which start opening the doors. It starts opening the ceiling of what they see possible for the persons within services. And so, you know, as peer providers, there's a unique way, and I'm not saying others don't, but there's this really unique and beautiful way in which we do the work that we do. It's really about like shining a light on individuals' personal strengths, right? Looking for and highlighting what's strong within them, bringing it out in places where they can't even see it. It's about utilizing human experience language, non-clinical language, and really just sharing and talking about just like circumstances that are happening, not as something that has to be fixed, but really as something that we just figure out and find ways to navigate with it. You know, I talk a lot about myself as I'm a person who hears and sees things that others don't. And over the years and over time, like I've just kind of had to figure out different ways to navigate the world. Some are kind of really creative that I've had incredible clinical providers in supporting me and coming up with, kind of like instead of walking around with tinfoil on my head, it was tinfoil that got put in a cap, because then if I wore a cap, you didn't see the tinfoil over my head, right? These are the things we bring to the conversations. And it's about honoring the unique journey of each individual, and not only for the person, but also for the staff. Because y'all hear terms, and we hear terms frequent flyer or life is limited and all these things. And as a peer specialist, when we start stepping into that person-centered recovery process, it's looking at those strengths, what they're bringing, what they've learned from different experiences they've experienced, what they're bringing to the table, and really highlighting for the clinical staff what the person themselves wants us to highlight. And so I'm going to share with you here in a second one of the tools that actually I learned from this pilot program that we did in Texas. And I am very biased. I will just honestly say this, because this is the tool that really worked for me. And I'm going to show y'all a couple other tools that are out there. But when we started looking at and implementing the person-centered planning process within the LMHA I was working at, we started really looking at and highlighting, okay, like what did the role for the peer specialist like? What did it look like? And one of the things that was really identified early on was that we had this unique place and space that we could support people in this pre-planning meeting. Like the planning and the exploration of like what it was they're wanting to bring into their person-centered planning process, right? Being able to spend time with them as a peer specialist in that exploration mode, being able to spend time educating them really about what the person-centered planning was all about, their rights within it, identifying their support structures, talking about their recovery plan, what to expect within the meeting, and really supporting them and being prepared with their own language, their own words, and their own desires, so that when they stepped into that meeting, they weren't going in empty-handed. They weren't going into the meetings like so often I would see people, and I had for myself, like with this deer in the headlights look and just agreeing to whatever anything was said. And as a peer, as working and supervising this program and really exploring the ways in which the peer specialists could be supportive, when we were able to really do this process, incredible things happen. And there's a number of things within this document, which you're going to get a link to, but you've probably seen a number of different diagrams around the circle of supports. For many people, when you start thinking and talking about supports, it can be a shutdown right now in this moment because I have no family, my family's left me, my friends have left me, I don't have anyone. But when we start looking at this and in this planning meeting or just anytime, anywhere with a peer specialist kind of taking it on, like there's so many other ways in which persons can support a person that may not be just that really central circle, but that they're actually getting supports from the person at the local coffee shop or the bus driver or the person who always makes sure to notice that they came in the door when they were coming back to their apartment, right? And so really starting to come from that place of like exploration and also looking at, is there someone they want to attend the meeting? Is there someone they want to have there? A peer specialist is more than welcome or is more than able to go into that planning meeting should the person invite them. And that's a really key piece. A peer specialist is never going to do anything in relationship to any of this unless the person asks for that support. And, the hope is that the individual themselves is their voice is being heard. But there were many meetings when I would just go sit next to a person. And every once in a while they'd look at me and I would just kind of like say one word and then they would keep going, right? But maintaining that place of voluntary with the individual, this is an option. And here are just some other tools. There's this conversation around recovery roadmap, and these are just some highlights of it that you may want to look at, explore different ways of kind of doing that goal planning process, that pre-planning process, really getting a person prepared and educated for themselves about themselves as they go into that planning meeting. And so you're going to listen to my voice and it's what it is. But I want to actually share with you about an experience I had as a peer specialist supporting an individual. Now, just kind of for context, I was working in a transitional living program at the time, and this person, that's where they lived. So I'm going to hit play, and if y'all can't hear the volume, just let me know or wave your hand somehow. Okay. And I haven't hit play yet.
One experience I had is when I was working with an individual at the peer-led transitional house. Every time she would enter a meeting with her team, she came across as angry and unwilling to participate in her treatment. I spent some time meeting with her and speaking about the PCRP planning meeting that was going to occur in a few weeks. While we were working through the In the Driver's Seat document, we were able to have some very honest conversations. I was able to share some of my experiences with team meetings and how I would just shut down and not say anything because I felt so overwhelmed. Little by little, I shared more and more about some of my personal life experiences, and eventually we were able to connect with some very clear goals that she wanted to work towards, some that she was still too fearful to speak about out loud. So she just wrote them down. Before we completed the process, I asked what concerns she had about the planning meeting. She started to cry and slowly shared how important it was to her that she get her own place to live. And she was afraid that in the meeting she would get mad and start acting a fool. I just listened, and she shared what her struggles had been at another agency. When she said she wanted to go to work, they said she was delusional and made fun of her wanting to do this, as she was in and out of hospitals and had not worked since she was in high school. She lost it when this happened, crying uncontrollably, and was sent to the hospital. Ever since then, she told herself that she was never going to let that happen again. Never was she going to say she wanted a job, and never was she going into a meeting not ready to fight. We talked more about this and role played different scenarios. And after, she thanked me and said for the first time in a long time, she was looking forward to her planning meeting. I attended the meeting at her request, and while there, I said nothing and did nothing. It was wonderful to be able to experience the shock on the other providers' faces when she entered the meeting, not looking for a fight, but actively participating. I will never forget the look on her face when she left with her head held high and gave me a high five. That to me is the power of the peer role. After the meeting, she gained the confidence to walk down the street and put in a job application at a local business. She was hired on the spot, and by working alongside her team, she was able to navigate uncomfortable feelings as they arose. And 2 months later, she moved into her own apartment. When an individual is given the time and space to put themselves in the driver's seat of their own lives, magic occurs. I have seen this firsthand over and over.
I will say that, oops.
One experience I
Oh, we checked it. Oh, now, okay. We checked it. It didn't do it. Almost did it again. I was kind of in this place where probably about 3 weeks ago, I'm just kind of like, it's one of those things. I ran into another peer specialist who still worked at the organization where this individual was at. And I found out this was like 7 or 8 years ago that she's still in that exact same apartment and still actively living in the community to this very day. And it just gives me chill bumps because that's for me, and for me as a person who with lived experience have navigated these things, that's like this incredible beauty of what this person-centered planning process is. Like when it's really fully developed and explored. And so we start thinking about like those very specific things around the peer specialist role during the planning meeting. And I do want to be like really, really clear about this. It's got to be by request of the individual. It's as a peer specialist, I'll offer it and they can say yes or no. If a person's kind of what some of those needs are. Oftentimes, like as the peer specialist within that meeting, a peer specialist may provide a gentle reminder of previous conversations if the person's like looking at you or ask you directly. And prior to going into the meeting, it's really important that you talk through some of these different scenarios. If this should happen, what would you like for me to do? If this should happen, what would you like for me to do? Etc. And through role play so that we make sure that if we're in that planning meeting, we're only bringing forth what the individual is wanting to be shared. Not our opinion, not what we want for them, but what they want for themselves. And that's so key. And just kind of like in that story, we might just act as a silent but powerful ally. Someone who's right there by them, who they know is really believing in them and knows that they can. and it is key to note, it is not the peer specialist's role to facilitate the planning meeting or to create the plan. It can be really easy to like, and I've seen this in my own experience and in talking to others, to really kind of shift the planning or that facilitating of the planning meeting to the peer specialist because they have that relationship with the individual. It's not within the peer specialist role. It is not, once again, like, it's not a peer specialist role to facilitate the planning meeting or create the plan. I say that over and over because it's really important when we think about anywhere that peer support or peer roles are implemented within an organization, maintaining and staying out of those clinical roles. And, when I don't have a great way of actually explaining this, so I'm gonna like try and we're gonna go from this. And if I step in it, I apologize. But the other thing that a peer specialist can do within that planning meeting sometimes is assisting with significant communication barriers. And when I say that, what I mean, at times, the clinical staff may be sharing something and saying something that's exactly what the person is wanting, but the language is different, right? It's what they're asking for. They're sharing this. And so there's a place where there's been times I've seen it or I've done it myself where I just kind of like ask permission to, to speak or kind of ask permission to share something and just kind of explain what's this person is sharing and saying and confirming with that individual that that's the same thing that they're wanting. And so that's important. Not changing what's being said, not changing over here what's being said. But sometimes it's just kind of shifting and working with those disconnects, I guess is probably a better way to say it. Sometimes the disconnects with systemic language, disconnects with maybe how a person themselves also communicate. Because when you really know somebody and around somebody, there's maybe certain ways that they communicate or share things that others just may not catch. So those are the type of things I'm talking about. And throwing this in, one thing to note, when you start looking at the person-centered planning process, as many of you probably know, the actual planning meeting is not a billable service. This pre-planning process is a billable service, and not getting into the dollars and cents because I think just at what it provides, it's like more than worth it. But when you're thinking about sustainability, you're looking at all these other things. There's many things that happen within that pre-planning meeting that a peer specialist can be included and actually facilitate that are all related to skills building, right? And skills building, no matter like how you look at it or what it looks like, whether it's through PSR or skills training, or a peer specific billable service, occurred during this process. I do want to say one of the things that I've seen lately, and it may or may not be happening where you're working or what you're seeing, is a lot of organizations seem to be skipping some of this pre-planning part, or really looking at going straight to the person-centered recovery planning as the very first initial plan that a person has. And so there may not be a billable place or the ability to bill for this service because they're not open to peer support yet or whatever. For me, that doesn't mean don't do it. So I do want to add that in. Probably I don't want to get in the weeds with that, but it's something that I've kind of been navigating and seeing a lot, and actually actively exploring like how can we create like that best practice around it so that what many times as peer specialists review this pre-planning process is so integral and important. So with that being said, which is kind of a segue into what Amanda's going to take us over into this next part about some of the oops, sorry. I went a little bit fast. I apologize. This last little slide is the professional alliance with among providers. I don't know if y'all have noticed, and you probably haven't had a lot of opportunity to see Amanda and I together, is we intentionally do a lot of work together. intentionally in the sense of her clinical experience, my experience as a peer specialist, because there's something that can occur when peer specialists are partnering with the clinical staff within an organization. It's like the best of both worlds, like get to shine, and a person actually gets this beautiful space of a support team. Also looking at and finding the different ways around integrating peer providers within existing teams while honoring and maintaining the efficacy of the role. And there's some challenges related to this, but when a peer provider might be on a team that's in place, being able to really share about their lived experience, not so much sharing about the persons that they're seeing, but being able to bring a different perspective into the room, it can be really move things forward. That place of intentional team building and creating a space and providing individuals with this diverse team of providers that support their wellness and well-being. And now I'm going to throw it to Amanda to look at these lovely common challenges, because there are some.
There are. All right, Amy, if you want to stop sharing, and I'm going to take it over. If everybody, excellent. If everybody will hang in there with me just a second as I take over here. And we just want to preview some of the richer conversations we would love to offer during the TA session, or that you may want to have if you are doing consultation or supervision, or having conversations with leadership about what peer support looks like at your program or your agency. So here are some of the common challenges, and we previewed some of these. Also, I invite you to drop some of what you are imagining or have experienced in the chat box for us, because this will help us plan for the TA session and get a sense of what's going on out there across the US. So thinking about the role of peer support and PCRP, what are the challenges or the ways that you imagine peer support might be undermined that you've run across? So drop some of those ideas in the chat box for us. And we just want to highlight that there is an upcoming TA session on Wednesday, June 5th. And that's going to be at 1 o'clock Central Time, 2 o'clock Eastern. There are lots of different time zones. It'll be a 90-minute interactive session, and there'll be a registration link in the follow-up email. Here, let's take a few minutes. So here's one common challenge that we run into a lot that I think is important to touch on here before we end. So I think we probably all know that peer support is always voluntary, and the focus, the nature of that support that's provided is really determined by the person receiving the support, right? It's self-directed in its focus. It's really easy to all agree to that, right? It's easier said than done. And so there's a lot to unpack there. We are featuring a really cool resource that was developed by the National Association of Peer Supporters. Amy and I have loved to provide this resource to peer supporters and supervisors. So we just wanted to make sure everybody knows about this. You'll receive this in the follow-up email. We wanted to show you the core values include that peer support is voluntary and peer support is person-driven. What is so neat about this tool is it outlines how this shows up in the practice of peer support, but it also shows how each of these core values can show up in the practice by a supervisor, which I think is really, really neat. But we can unpack this a little bit more if you can join us in the TA session. It's really easy, right, to put peer support on a plan. And that person, whose plan, is being developed says, yeah, the peer support sounds wonderful. Let's put it on there. But then what happens from there, right? What happens if the person has a probation or parole officer that says you're mandated to comply with the services, right? And they change their mind, right? Or what happens if that planning meeting is really person-centered, but then for whatever reason, maybe the agency or the program hasn't fully adopted a person-centered approach. And after that, everybody's asking about compliance and peer support is on the plan, right? And so peer support kind of becomes tainted over time because the person starts to feel pressure to comply with peer support, even though they can change their mind at any time, right? So there's a lot to unpack here. Also, how peer support is written as a service on the plan. We want to make sure that those services are individualized to the person. They're not cookie cutter. But what if, that peer supporter shows up on any given day and the individual says, I don't want to work on that. I need support around this other thing, right? So there's a lot to talk about here. And we can really get into that. Another common challenge that we run into is really thinking about peer supporters and the role of advocates and those team expectations. And Amy was starting to get at this a little bit. So one example that we run into is when it appears wrong, but is actually right. So a peer specialist is completely within their role, but for some reason, their coworkers are saying the peer supporter is not a team player, right? You can think of all the different scenarios that fall under this title. They're not sharing information with us, or they're not encouraging the person to follow the treatment recommendations. Why aren't they doing that, right? And I think you all probably know some of the answers to that. So that can be a really rich topic. Another one is kind of the flip of that, right? Where it might feel to the peer supporter, and this is true for those of us advocating passionately, I think, in any role, right? It might feel like we're advocating in a way that is really appropriate, but actually it's contrary to our ethics, where really we might be fostering mistrust between people who are receiving services and the other providers. And really, we do have a responsibility to foster a productive and constructive relationship between people and their providers whenever that's possible, right? And so there's a lot to unpack there. Another one that we wanted to preview is, and I love how Amy puts this, I think she can lead this discussion better than me, but finding your voice, if you've been focused on being a more passive recipient of services for years, sometimes when you start to speak up, it isn't always pretty, and that can be pathologized. And if the peer supporter is really championing that, sometimes it's like, what are you doing? Like, why are you causing so many problems? So sometimes, that can really be an issue. So we just have a few conclusions and takeaways from today, even though there's so much more to talk about. We really want to emphasize that trusting that peer support, when implemented with integrity, and when peer supporters understand their role and they are given support to stay within their role, really always supports person-centered recovery planning. I believe that. The other part that we really want to emphasize, and I think you've heard this a couple times today, is that when peer providers understand the requirements and the quality standards of planning, of person-centered recovery planning, they are better positioned to advocate for changes at the agency. They're also better positioned to inform the people for whom those plans are supposed to be, right, in support of, so that those individuals can walk into those planning meetings with high expectations. and advocate for themselves. And that, I think, is one of the biggest things that we want to see, right? So again, and I don't know if we've dropped this common favorite saying yet, Amy, or not, but peer support should be happening both within the clinical system and outside of the clinical system. And that's kind of a controversial thing, right? A lot of peer supporters are like, we don't want to have anything to do with the clinical system. But again, we believe that the clinical system really needs more people with lived experience. And so we talk about peer support being in, but not of the system.
Can I just a little slant on that as well?
Yep. Just want to let you know we have 3 minutes left.
I know it's also the place where many times when it's just a reminder that peer specialists or peer supporters who are working in the system is that their one directive is for what that individual is wanting and choosing, right? Versus what the system is wanting and choosing for them. And that's also some of the places in which the in but no, the system comes into play.
Perfect. So we would love for you to let us know what questions are emerging for you that we can either quickly address here at the end of the session or prepare to dive into with a little bit more time if you can make it to the TA session, or if we can address something that was confusing or needs some attention by email, we'd be happy to do that. I'm going to pull up my chat here so that I can see that. And I also want to make sure that everybody has the link to the evaluation as we close. It is very short, and we really appreciate your feedback on these. And yeah, the TA session is coming up. It's on a Wednesday. It's the first Wednesday of June, the 5th, I believe. Is that right? I'm past that slide. And now that I'm in presentation mode, it's taken over my screen, Janet.
Yes, June 5th, confirming it's June 5th. And there'll be
Okay, great. Thank you, Janet.
invitations to that session for all of you, again, as a reminder in our follow-up email. Kathy, there'll be a link to the evaluation. You don't necessarily have to scan the QR code on the screen. It'll also be in your follow-up email.
Yep. You can click on the link in the chat box that Jennifer just put in there if you want that now, or you can look for the follow-up email that'll be coming to you. Either way, not everybody likes those QR codes. You're already having to do them in restaurants to see the menu all the time, so we understand that. But again, if you have the a minute to drop in some of the things that you'd like us to unpack during the TA session, we would really appreciate that. Good question, George. That'd be a good one to take on. Thank you so much for joining us today and for the work that you're doing and for your interest in peer support and PCRP.
And thank
Have
you
a great
again,
afternoon,
Amanda.
everybody.
Thank you to
all.
Amanda and Amy. It's a very rich
Thanks,
conversation.
Amanda. Thanks,
Hope
Amy.
to see lots of you back to continue it.
Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, you
Y'all
too.
too.